Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot. Um, I have the pleasure today of welcoming you to the 2025 Tom Cassidy Lecture. Tom Cassidy was a member of the Bowdoin class of 1972, and he was an influential financial journalist for CNN in the 1980s and early 90s. As CNN's senior business correspondent, Tom was a trusted and clear-eyed reporter of business news, and he conducted in-depth interviews with many top CEOs in the signature program Pinnacle. When Tom was diagnosed with AIDS, he bravely turned the camera on himself, allowing his struggle with the disease to be profiled in a remarkably open way on national television, right up until his death in 1991. This lecture series is a part of Tom's deeply meaningful legacy, and we are indebted to him for creating it and for his family, friends, and classmates, and for their support as well. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to one of Tom's close friends, Mike Thomas, who's joining us here tonight. Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for making the trip to Brunswick and being here. Absolutely. Our talk tonight is going to be fantastic. I don't mind saying that because it's going to be really great. And it's going to be a conversation between our own, that is Bowdoin's own, Theo Green, Associate Professor of Sociology, Chair of the Sociology Department, and our distinguished 2025 Tom Cassidy speaker, Ronan Farrow. Before I introduce Ronan, I just want to say one thing about Professor Green, a couple of things about Professor Green. In doing introductions like this, you read people's bios, and they're always fantastic with a lot of incredible work. But I decided to ask one of his colleagues what makes him special in such an important part of Bowdoin's campus. And they said something that really stood out. They said, as insightful as his scholarship is, he cares that much about teaching as well, which I think is really special. For students in the room, take one of his classes if you haven't already. Ronan Farrow was a multi-talented, remarkably accomplished, and profoundly important investigative reporter, and more. He's a documentarian and author, and he has many other roles that many of us know him from, which I'll talk a little bit about right now. The through line that connects all of that different work is a true search for and deliberate examination for the truth. You have uncovered abuse, you have looked at injustice at the highest levels of government and industry, and your work has mobilized societal change. That's not hyperbole. As an investigative reporter and contributing editor to The New Yorker, you broke some of the most explosive and impactful stories of the last decade, including the Harvey Weinstein scandal, specifically the illicit use of Pegasus spyware across the world, the controversial conservatorship of Britney Spears, among others. His work for the magazine has won the Pulitzer Prize, the George Polk Award, and the National Magazine Award, and has helped launch social movements across the world. Mr. Farrow, or as you'll learn in a second, Dr. Farrow, was the author of 2 New York Times best-selling books, War on Peace, The End of Diplomacy and the Decline of American Influence, and Catch and Kill, Lies, Spies, and a Conspiracy to Protect Predators. Catch and Kill is a revelatory expose on the ways in which powerful people, men, in our society have evaded responsibility for sexual abuse, and at the same time a breathtaking account of the obstacles that Ronan overcame to tell this groundbreaking story. This book is a phenomenon, and I encourage you to give it a look if you haven't. It was named a Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post, Time, NPR, Library Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the Telegraph, among others, and named as a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and adapted as both a popular podcast and HBO documentary series. You have served as an anchor and investigative reporter on MSNBC and NBC News. You reported for many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times. You are a journalist, but you're also fearless in a way that I think is really important for us to take it into account. You have raised public consciousness about both the danger and importance of investigative journalism. And in a recent project, you explored the perils of journalism during the COVID pandemic. You also had that film nominated for an Emmy Award. Ronan is a graduate of Yale Law School, a member of the New York Bar, a Rhodes Scholar with a PhD from Oxford University, and also, importantly, a liberal arts undergrad at Bard College. Ronan served as a former State Department official who served in Afghanistan and Pakistan, has been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people and one of GQ's Men of the Year. Ronan's work to expose injustice his willingness to speak truth to power is more important than ever at a time when history is happening every moment of every day. I think you're going to be busy for a while, and I'm glad you're spending some of that time with us here this evening. Please help me welcome Ronan Farrow and Theo Green to the stage.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming out in the cold tonight. I appreciate it.
It's not that cold.
Thank
Welcome to
you.
Maine.
I'm really
This come from
losing
California.
my New England cred here. I did grow up in Connecticut, but this is a whole other level of cold. It's a lot for me.
Well, we're having some hot topics this evening, so hopefully, yes, hot topics.
That was the working title of this lecture. Hot Topics
Hot.
with Theo and Ronan.
Yes. I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you, and thank you all for joining us. This is, hopefully the next hour will be a part of a generative conversation built around a very interesting title for me, The Power of the Next Generation. I think that's such an important thing, given the fact that both journalists and academics share one thing in common: we seem to be under threat for some strange reason. And so, as a reminder to all of us before we begin, it's important to remember that there are a lot of opinions out there, and so we hope to foster a respectful environment for us to be able to engage in meaningful dialogue. So don't let me catch these hands, okay? Thank you so much for joining us. I kind of want to start, I want to fangirl a little bit here. The thing I really have enjoyed so much about your work is the fact that you have always seemed to pursue the truth no matter what the cost. So my first question is, what inspires your practice, your journalist practice? Did you always believe that journalism could have the kind of transformative power that your journalism has had?
Well, in a very just personal and almost crass sense, I think I was a kid who, had this intellectual life. I did a sort of Doogie Howser child prodigy thing and went to college very young. I went to college when I was 11. And that's why I'm so poorly adjusted socially, fam. And then I also grew up around a lot of storytelling and art. And I was always very drawn to telling stories. And I think probably if my cognitive capacity, if the promise I'd had as a child prodigy had redounded to like a great mathematician's mind, I'd be a more serious person. But because it didn't go that way, and I found myself sort of sidetracked into the humanities more, then I had this combination of instincts. Can I do something serious? Can I do something that gives back to the world? And that's the other serious answer to the question. I grew up in a family where I was given a really strong spirit of public service. And I had all these adopted siblings from around the world who had special needs, disabilities, and different challenges. And it is profoundly shaping to who you become as an adult if all of the people that you love, if your sense of community is multicolored, embodies different challenges from around the world, it makes it much harder to look away. So my mom invited a ton of chaos with those choices, but it came from a very beautiful, sincere place, and it was a lot to live up to. So then I was tempering that through the lens of, okay, how can I do something that's sort of intellectually stimulating or serious or satisfies my sense of curiosity, something that gives back, and then also something that's a little rooted in narrative or storytelling. And honestly, I don't know, like I looked at Diane Sawyer and I was like, she's hot and blonde, that seems like a glam way to find an intersection of those things. That I could like tell important stories and be super serious and tough, but also be kind of cute. So that was I think probably like the childhood genesis of of getting into that space or seeing that as something that I might pursue. And then I just naturally fell into it. I was talking to a wonderful group of students earlier about this. I started writing op-eds when I was traveling in various conflict zones, and that gave me a little bit of experience with print and writing, and deepened my love of writing. And then that in turn led to kind of a side hustle doing nerdy political commentary on TV, mostly international geopolitical. So we're talking very nerdy. We're talking like CNN International. And then that in turn led to cable news anchoring and then network news anchoring. And I think it was very clear to me navigating the vicissitudes of network TV that I wanted to lean into depth a bit more, and the short form investigative pieces I was doing for the Today Show or for my cable show often were at odds with that format-wise. And so a combination of literally having to take a story to print because a network wouldn't run it, and then also feeling frustrated over time with the superficial nature of reading headlines and being confined to network TV sound bites led me to more print and more long-form television and feature journalism over time.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. As you were talking, I couldn't help thinking about the description in the packet I got, you being the youngest old person in the room.
Those are some old quotes, by the way. I have not been the youngest anything in the room in quite a few seasons.
You still look youthfully.
Thank you, you too.
Oh, thanks. How sweet. But I couldn't help but think about, what does it mean to be in these spaces that sometimes are confining, but as someone of a different generation, you have that sense of freedom to break away from perhaps the confines of traditional journalism that led you to the place that you are.
Well, I think a lot less about the confines imposed by others and a lot more about the sincere question of maturity these days. I really had to actually get out of a posture of relentless careerism and ambition and go through a lot of pain and low points to grow personally. And obviously that's still a work in progress for any of us who are curious about the world and about ourselves. But I do think I'm a vastly more mature person now, and also still so very immature in so many ways, than I was, when there was that kind of hoopla and those kinds of quotes about me. I would like to think that I recognize that kind of maturity, and I recognize when people are in the midst of that kind of growth and evolution, regardless of their age. I think it can come at different points in life, but for most people, it does take time and experience and challenge and pain, as I mentioned. I do think that growth often comes from moments of devastation where you have to rebuild. So, I'm careful to not fetishize youth in that way, or render in simplistic terms the challenges that I had being a child prodigy or getting bad press for being allegedly too young for jobs. I stepped into government at a time when the knives were out for really anyone coming into that administration in that particular war zone. I was working in Afghanistan. And I was sincerely credentialed enough, and then some, for the job I was stepping into. But I think I was also sensitive to the fact that, as I just alluded to, maturity comes with time in meaningful ways. And even if some of the blowback that I got, some of the constraints you're referring to, was misplaced, I had empathy for it. And I knew how annoying it was that I was like rolling into this position that was very sensitive. Although it was not so crazy also for a young lawyer to be in that role. There was an excess of agita about it because of my profile, I think. But I was managing relationships with NGOs on the ground, which is a substantive portfolio in some ways, but it's also, outside of the sort of very white-hot center of the power structures of a war zone like that, outside of the military apparatus. And I think it was an early experience with learning to become more comfortable with being disliked some of the time by some of the people. It was really informative in that particular part of being the youngest guy in the room with respect to my misgivings about government bureaucracies. And I think ideally institutions should embrace both kind of wisdom and people who have been around systems for a long time, and also rabble-rousers and upstarts that can shake things up and reform.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as you're talking about it, it's always a process of growth, and sometimes it's a recognition that even engaging in change takes time. But I think with youth also comes the kind of boldness and bravery that can allow you to try to tackle on challenges and take on challenges.
Yeah.
What do you think, as a journalist, has been your biggest challenge? Or put it a different way, what are some of the biggest challenges you think you're confronting as a journalist today?
How much time do we have?
We just got started. It's plenty of time.
It's a scary time for this profession, and I think for our democracy. I think regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, if you have a fundamental investment in the project of protecting people's basic freedoms, this should be a worrying time. And the specific subset of that problem that I focus on in my work, maintaining the free flow of information to create an informed public that can exercise autonomy, independent thinking, and self-determination, is particularly imperiled. It is not a new set of phenomena that we're witnessing in the world. The demonizing of the press is a classic foundational part of a fascist, authoritarian, strongman playbook. And so it's not terribly surprising in retrospect. I think there was a contingent of kind of liberal-minded thinkers. I don't mean politically liberal, I mean in the more fundamental, broad sense of liberalism, that wrote off fascism as a problem of history and the past. And I think what we're learning now, what we're in the midst of now, is a realization that actually the siren song that authoritarianism offers is something that the species will always be vulnerable to. Because it takes a lot of effort to think independently. Like Kierkegaard talks about the anxiety of freedom. Not everyone wants to confront that. And it is very, very seductive to give people a simple other that they can pour their anxiety, fear, and anger into. And a simple set of commandments, just be loyal to the cause, be blindly factional, that they can follow and kind of shut off their brains, because it is scary once you start engaging in the problem more deeply. And I really understand how that happens, because I share the fear and the anxiety and at times the desire to retreat, but I think it's more important than ever that we all really engage, because a confluence of politically exploitative actors who are preying upon those vulnerabilities, systemic changes in the economics around news and the flow of information, and around technology, all of that is contributing to a real crisis in terms of freedom and in terms of having an informed populace. I love that you think about this historically, because I'm reminded of sociologist Max Weber, who taught in Politics as Vocation, talks about journalists as politicians, and the role they play in the early modern era, but then also, too, how journalists are also known from the worst of their kind, right? And in his case, thinking about the rise of yellow journalism at the period.
And so as you're talking, I couldn't help but think, how do you, as a journalist, then break through the silence? We have so much noise around us in terms of ideas that are presented as factual, ideas that are presented as news. So how do you break through all of that din?
Well, there's vast systems arrayed against us as we undertake that challenge. The factors that I was referring to, political headwinds that are cynically invoking anti-press rhetoric, demonizing the press, to try to keep people uninformed and keep them away from questioning the facts, keep them loyal to simple, reductive, binary causes. The fact that journalists of their own making, the media, not just the news media, of its own making, has created vulnerabilities and openings for mistrust, right? The whole descent into kind of partisan opinion journalism dominating cable over recent decades has eroded a lot of the expectation that the news media can actually provide meaningful, deep investigative insights and unearth facts without political motive behind it. The shifts in social media technology means that this current and next generation are going to be imbibing fascist agitprop and disinformation that's politically motivated in a way that is much more immersive and consuming and has fewer guardrails. So scholars on authoritarianism from prior generations where this recurred could have never imagined the scenario that we find ourselves in now, where an obedient public is literally glued to screens, a kind of Orwellian version of whatever could have been imagined before. And being fed a constant fire hose. And of course, we see right now a kind of a rising oligarchy that is seeking to press further in that direction. You look at Mark Zuckerberg gleefully dismantling any kind of fact-checking apparatus on his systems. You look at everything that Elon Musk is doing and the flourishing of misinformation as a kind of deliberate agenda item in how he's built his takeover of Twitter. This all goes to the point I made before, that there is a grave danger in this looming set of political headwinds that seek to exploit misinformation and a lack of an informed public. And so it's on all of us to question, to fact check ourselves, to just type that fact into Google. I get family members who are really well-intentioned sending me things that they've seen online where I have to tell them, like, this is made up. And smart, informed people who read a fair amount of news, they fall for it. And so it's just going to take more and more work to escape the disinformation trap. And there's going to be more and more vast muscular constituencies that are invested in accelerating disinformation and know that facts and trust in facts can erode their grip on power. So I think one of the lanes of responding to that is building more robust and more economically sustainable journalism. But because right now we find ourselves in a situation where the business model around journalism is profoundly broken and we haven't figured out sustainability in the industry, a lot rests on us. I think we've all got to be our own fact checkers and our own contributors to a discourse that is kinder, more thoughtful, and less binary.
And I appreciate that from the perspective of an educator. And my next question, I think, is kind of fueled from a question that my students would ask me a lot based on that answer. And that is, how? Especially in an era of artificial intelligence, right? Where we can type in the information in Google and we can still get misinformation. What can we do? How can we go about doing this to sort of dismantle the misinformation that we are overwhelmed with every day?
Well, AI is a really interesting double-edged sword. Obviously, as with, say, the Industrial Revolution, there's these fears of everyone being out of work, now that there's this new technology, And indeed, it's easy to see how some forms of journalism, particularly more surface level breaking news coverage and sort of basic analysis, could be automated much more. If you look at the latest version of ChatGPT, it's very good at that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
There's big caveats. AI still hallucinates a lot right now. I mean, this is a known phenomenon. And if you ask ChatGPT about it, ChatGPT will tell you, like, oh no, you better check everything I tell you.
Yeah.
You cannot trust that shit. Truly, I mean, I've never prior to the last few weeks even like posed a question about a story I've worked on to a chatbot. I have on a story I'm editing right now, like dipped a toe in and not relied on it, but sort of asked it questions. You know, here's with permission from a source, I'm sharing a 100-page interview transcript. Like, what do you think about question X? And some of it is useful. And then sometimes you say, you know, give me all the quotes on a specific theme, and it just makes shit up. And you got to tell it like 3 times no, because it's not trained by or for journalists. So you got to tell it again and again. No. When I say I want quotes, I mean not imaginary quotes. I mean quotes from this person in this transcript. And then it'll go like, oh, okay, fine, I guess. It's not going to be as good, but I'll try. So it's still something that needs you know, human quality control in a gigantic way. And there's going to be all kinds of pitfalls, and you know, the first scandal where some publication lets something across that's not properly fact-checked because AI fed it to them, for sure. And all of that does highlight the need for human fact-checking, which is such a rare, precious resource, and I'm so grateful to be at the New Yorker where they invest so much in fact-checking, famously, and would that were the norm. I do think that ultimately I could see a scenario where it is a net benefit to society that AI can contribute to research and to informing people. A lot depends on decisions that are made policy-wise in the coming years, the corporate power players that have control of the most powerful AI and how those AI models are trained. But fundamentally, there is no reason why it couldn't be a tool that enhances journalism. For me already, as long as I'm checking and double-checking, I see just in the last few weeks, putting that toe in, how work that previously would have required a lot of library-style old-school research can be really instantly synthesized through these new mediums. So I'm overall excited about it, and I think to the labor concerns around it, it's going to change journalism, but I see it at least in the medium-long future actually bolstering more than it takes away. Certainly for the investigative end of what we do in my profession, it is not yet anywhere close to replicating the human touch required to get someone to a place of trust and to kind of protect them as they disclose secrets. So that's something where you could envision some tools that help with that sort of social engineering, if you will, to read a person's facial expressions and have AI say like, this is what they really care about. Yeah. But all of it that you can envision in the next at least, I don't know, half century, certainly 20, 30 years, I think is going to be enhancing rather than replacing.
But a caveat to all of my students that want to write their papers with AI, you just heard what he said, fact check, right? Research is still important.
I'm really interested, like my partner is a PhD student and is constantly mulling over this question of like, what does academic research become once we get over our compunctions about AI and the role is really just kind of checking the work of AI? Yeah. Because it is getting to the point where you can pose a complex research question and it can instantly do an incredibly sophisticated synthesis of every piece of literature out there with charts and graphs and like really quite reasonable analysis. So I mean, that's more a question for you. Like, what does it do to academics?
Well, this is not on me right now. No, I'm kidding. No, I think this is something that we're debating because we think that AI does have an important role in terms of how we think about even the liberal arts model these days, right? And there's lots of possible synergies that can come out of it. But at the same time, I think, I hope that our students can also get a rudimentary understanding of what it means to do academic research and academic writing and be thinkers of themselves and independent thinkers of the world, right? Which I think is an important part of, the whole theme of the power of the next generation. Hopefully that they're not simply being fed, right? But that there are, independent thinkers, compassionate thinkers, empathic thinkers, as you've mentioned, going out doing good in the world. At least that's what we hope, right?
And AI being to some extent created in our own cultural image means it's a real live unresolved question.
Exactly.
Whether AI evolves as it becomes potentially more intelligent than us to also be more compassionate.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we pivot a little bit on that, thinking about, again, the topic of the power of the next generation. We talk about artificial intelligence, but what do you think is one of the greatest challenges confronting this up and coming generation of young people?
Well, we're talking about them right now. The glut of disinformation and the related descent into a really kind of strident Manichaean discourse all the time is very antithetical to the values we're talking about. It obscures information, it prevents bridge building, it prevents constructive problem solving. We're in a moment where it's a reliable feedback loop that someone can make up a piece of just completely fictional disinformation about someone, a conspiracy theory, sick a politicized fan base on that person, dox them, and just send a huge population to go make them miserable. And a point during which very little will counteract that, because a large part of that type of constituency that is going to go into attack mode based on something that is pretty obviously a fiction is just not going to be interested in factual correctives. So that's deeply troubling to me. I do think that there's also hope that each time I see one of those episodes play out, I also see, I don't know the comparative size of these populations, but another population where even amongst those sort of blind factionalists, you can get to some of them and say, hey, here are some facts. Like, here's where this thing is made up. And sometimes, not all the time, because there are the people who just dig in further and they're truly not interested in conversation or in facts. It's purely emotional, and it almost becomes enshrined as a value to thumb one's nose at the facts. But for these other more moderate players, I think you can say, hey, here's where you're basing this attack on a fiction, and have I've seen it happen actually in discourse around me, and sometimes have a pretty significant constituency say, oh, sorry, I got it wrong. So the double-edged sword of big swaths of the population living in local news deserts, not having access to, through their self-protective algorithmic bubbles, information that makes them question their assumptions. The double-edged sword of it is that those people who will blindly follow the attack command, some of them also will then be a total blank slate when you say, hey, maybe think about this. I think people are open, and most people are not as unkind as the kind of funhouse mirror of the internet makes them seem. And I think we all have an opportunity to break through to those people. And that means, you and me in our day-to-day lives and interactions and how we live out our values. But it also specifically means journalists, for those, who are in this room who work in that field, or the student journalists that I talked to earlier today. I think this next generation of reporters is going to be so crucial. They're going to have gigantic challenges because it is an industry without a clear economic future. Nobody has cracked the model of how exactly you make it work. But there are a lot of interesting experiments which we can talk about, and the work is going to still be necessary. There is a reason it's enshrined in the Constitution in the way that it is. And there's a reason why in a moment like this, it's so clear to me that one of the big voids that we're witnessing is of information. Yeah. So I just, I have a lot of fear about the future of the profession, but also a lot of hope. Because I do think it's going to be one of the things that pulls us out of tearing at each other and burning down our country.
Oh, absolutely. Can you talk a little more about those kinds of experiments? I'm kind of intrigued by, some of the things that might be, generating at this time that might help us break through all of this.
Well, I think the experiment of news as entertainment, while of course there is a component of news storytelling that is about resonating with an audience, the more crass end of that was embodied by partisan cable news over the last 20 years plus was a failed experiment. Economically, aside from anything else. It was very, very profitable for a few players for some time, but it also profoundly eroded trust in the news and contributed to this Manichaean reality that I'm bitching about. Yeah. The whole Fox News versus MSNBC shouting match, I think really did the culture and news culture harm. Even if there, was good journalism that happened in the midst of that here and there. The fundamental profit motive and framework really did, I think, screw us in very significant ways. And, I witnessed firsthand the kind of craven interference that can happen within that business model when you have both subtle and overt displays of the preferences of corporate owners insinuating themselves into newsrooms. It is very difficult in that kind of a moneyed news setting when you're producing expensive content with expensive pieces of talent, owned by companies that have much more consequential equities in other sectors, to have any kind of independence. What a fantasy that you could have independence in that scenario. And so I think people see that, and that contributes to declining trust in the news media. And yet we don't have some gangbusters alternative that's taking off in the same way. What we do have are experiments, right? We have we have donation models. We have ProPublica. We have The Guardian. We have interesting international comparative examples of publicly subsidized news, which there's all sorts of obvious reasons to have misgivings about potential interference with that approach too. But the fact is, I as far as I am aware, haven't seen a lot of evidence that say the CBC is massively fraught with government interference. I think there are ways to put up firewalls, and we know that because some countries have. Honestly, I think PBS does great work, even though it's now being demonized. Yeah. And so private contributions, public subsidies, all really interesting. Yeah. Obviously, there's the kind of billionaire patronage model that has come hand in hand with the rise of oligarchy right now. And that's a crapshoot, and it just depends on the owner. You can wind up with the Washington Post still doing great work under Jeff Bezos. We'll see for how long. Yeah. Or you can wind up with the complete demise of any journalism at, for instance, Meta, where they were trying to get into the game of news for a while, and now they're just saying death to fact checking.
Yeah. What do you think about social media as one of these experiments? I find social media so interesting because it seems to give people much more direct access to a public of some sort. In terms of, when we think about the president who sometimes bypasses, journalists to do that. What role do you think social media plays in terms of contemporary journalism?
I think it's more often than not, despite sort of early promise where we had, a revolution in Iran, much more visible to people because people were tweeting, in the last 20 years, I think it's become clear that it's a net negative. I think that social media algorithms really came to relentlessly prioritize sensationalism and anger, and afford very little space for nuance. And it's also become an obstacle to the truth. These are disinformation machines. Yeah. And unfortunately, a utopian eventuality wherein the owners of these companies got together and regulators got together and we actually had fact-checking built into these systems. They spent resources to continue the practice of saying, hey, this is not true and here's why. All of which could have been quite empowered by AI, but that's gonna really go out of the window now. So I think mostly it's a danger, and I think philosophically too, the way that it gates people off into their own little bubbles of more and more extreme content that they agree with is really unfortunate. Now, I think there are wrinkles. Like I talked with some of the student journalists earlier about TikTok, which has all sorts of problems within its algorithm, but it is an interesting embodiment of the continued appetite for explainers and deep dives. A lot of the content that rises to the top on TikTok is explanatory and almost documentary in nature. And some of it is good, some of it is bad, but there's good stuff in there too. So more than the kind of violence, unrest, and hate speech algorithm of the present day artist formerly known as TikTok, as a Twitter, or the horniness algorithm of Instagram. I think TikTok. Well, we got a couple of chuckles at that one. I think TikTok does show us that information and research can thrive on a social media platform, and I don't totally know what we do with that information in terms of monetization for my profession, but I'm hoping some of the students in this room can help crack that.
Well, and that was going to be my next question.
No
thinking
crash.
About, no, please rush fast, quickly. No, but I think there's something there in terms of, the next generation has so many tools at their disposal and potential tools at their disposal they could possibly wield to some kind of good, right? What other things do you think is unique about this generation? As we talk about, this talk being titled "The Power of the Next Generation," what kind of things do you see in this generation that can give us hope in terms of fighting all of this?
Well, every time I go to a college and talk to a group of student journalists, I have more hope, because I think it's clear people aren't giving up the fight. People get how important it is for us all to be informed and able to think independently. And even looking at an industry that is so in disarray and in which job opportunities are so scant, I was just hanging out with a group of students who were like, yeah, let's do this. So that's really heartening to me. I don't know, on this question of how is this generation fundamentally different, I have always been skeptical of that framing. Like I would just want to. I mean, you're the academic. I would just want to see actual research on that. I think more often than not, circumstances change and technologies change, but young people of whatever generation seem to me to be broadly quite similar and have the same sort of advantages and disadvantages. I think we're talking about a specific set of challenges facing this upcoming generation that are in some ways distinctively shaped by technological change and also, I think, by kind of the collapse of late-stage capitalism, right? Like a lot of what we're talking about with the rise of an oligarchy within the United States and the seizing of so much power in private hands and the radical over-concentration of wealth leading to all of this imbalance and anger, and disinformation culture flourishing in a void left behind by news. Um, those are due to a specific endpoint of decades of economic policies and concordant technological development. But I don't think the young people confronting that are, by any evidence I've seen, particularly different from the young people who were, confronting the Industrial Revolution.
Well, and that's true, but I think the problem is we do grow up, right? And sometimes it's difficult to think, we become disillusioned, we become by what we see and the fact that we want to affect change in some real way, but sometimes we can't, or that it is slow. And so I do think there is a lot that the older generation can do to continue to support what the next generation, again, they're not different, but, I think we have to tap in that childlike.
Well, people at different ages are different, as you're pointing out.
Yeah.
Even if within each period of history, young people have shared traits. And I think, we need young people and old to be a part of confronting this moment and creating a kinder, more nuanced, more thoughtful discourse and pulling away from the downward spiral into the kind of blind factionalism that I just talked about.
Yeah.
To hew away from the hyper-reductive statements about groups of people and the kind of simplistic political animosity, and talk in a much more granular way about shared challenges.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly, maybe naively, believe that people are relieved when you take the conversation in that direction. I just think as much as perversions of these algorithms have trained us to be seduced by extremism and the kind of reductive posture I talked about and the kind of anger I talked about, people are saturated with that, and they're so relieved, certainly I am, when someone is just thoughtful and talks about people in complicated terms. Like, people aren't monsters or heroes, they're human beings struggling through, and this is how we're all messed up, and this is how maybe some people are particularly messed up, and we should be wary of that. But like, let's humanize everyone and talk about the problems in more rounded, complex ways that bring us together.
Yeah. To pivot slightly, who are the kind of people that inspire you in terms? You're out there a lot in the world. Like, who you find are people that are doing this kind of work, making this kind of change?
That guy who made Melania's hat.
I love that. Okay.
I'm very grateful for journalists right now. Spoiler alert.
Talk about journalism, it makes sense.
Yeah, I think every time I see a good, complex piece of enterprise reporting, every time I see whistleblowers within the current government chaos speaking to a journalist who works with them and protects them responsibly, I am more hopeful. So I hope that everyone, subscribes to your favorite publications. That's another big part of the economic solution. Like, the New Yorker is afloat because of a subscription model, so subscribe to the New Yorker. It's also very pretty. I love the cartoons. Not to just be so myopic and navel-gazing, but I do also, like, every time I read anything David Remnick writes, I'm like, God bless that man for living in that space of nuance that we're talking about. I think there are a very few politicians who, in this moment, have been kind of speaking truth to power. And also historians. People like Tim Snyder, the fascism expert, has been very prescient, I think, in his analyses. And I think that the Democratic Party really failed in very fundamental ways, the Democratic establishment writ large, across recent years.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, this broken, shambling apparatus that is the Democratic establishment has been sort of the sole vehicle for liberal values in Washington. And that is a real challenge because I'm a deeply nonpartisan person in my bones. You know, I care about values and I care about policies, and I have zero loyalty to any party. And in my journalism, I'm a scoop chaser and really agnostic about who it affects negatively or caring about such a thing. But I think one thing that the journalistic establishment had to awaken to was that they were in a misguided effort to be fair, introducing all this false equivalence that was normalizing very abnormal things that actually should have been treated as a state of emergency and reported on as such. And I reflect on my own work and periods of time where I've sort of been sucked into that social media feedback loop where anyone reasonable-minded is so affected when you get accused of being partisan.
Yes.
So I'm like, great, let me like work overtime to find more negative stories about Democrats, you know? And it really took years of growing into the realization that that was a very deliberate trap that was being set, and that actually the fair, nonpartisan journalism was going to come from not caring about being called unfair. You know, you have to have the compass inside you to know that you're not politically motivated and to call out the facts really clearly. And the kind of social and cultural and economic structures all drove towards so many years of false equivalence that I do think the press really failed in a lot of ways. So a number of those figures that I'm talking about across media and politics are the people who rose above that brokenness and above the discourse that couched things as business as usual, and were like, no, this is an emergency, and our basic freedoms are at stake. And unfortunately, I think there was too little of that too late.
I also can't help but wonder whether it's also, time as well. Like, I think sometimes the speed or the necessity to try to get the story out or to break the story first, without necessarily having all the information or all the facts, right? Especially given the fact that so many different sources are out there now feeding this information. It seems to create kind of a, it seems like a very difficult situation to be in as a journalist, to sort of try to take the time to get it right, to try to take the time to tell the truth, to rise above all of that, both the noise and misinformation, but then also to have the kind of nuance that you're sort of speaking to.
Yes. I mean, I've done both breaking news and long-form investigative reporting that takes a long time to cook, and they both carry their challenges.
Yes.
And I think that there is difficulty in inserting nuance in both in different ways. It's just always a challenge that we need to rise to and center in our work as journalists to make sure that it is rounded and complicated and that it tackles human foible in a way that is compassionate and complicated and non-binary, I think for sure there are times when I look back at really breakneck breaking news coverage that I've been involved in and think of all the ways in which I would have injected more nuance if there hadn't been the time imperative, or it would have done this extra layer of analysis or something, made it subtler, better, or more sensitive. And for what it's worth, that's probably a big part of why a majority of my output is longer form and takes more time. But I still believe that confronted with the right lead, if anyone in this room calls me after this talk and says, I've got a scoop for you, if I've got to move fast and turn something around in 24 hours, I'll do it with nuance. God damn it.
Couple last questions before we open it up to the audience. aside from journalism, are there any other, ways in which I think we can act or become more engaged, right? I think a lot of young people are not necessarily prone to journalism, right? But they may be thinking about other ways of changing the world. Can you speak to some of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't at all mean to suggest that journalism is the only important avenue for change. Right now, we're also facing a war on education and on research. And so every academic in the room has my admiration. What you're doing is really important, and in the same way we discussed this being the case for my profession, what you do, just continuing to work in the coming years and continuing to impart knowledge, either as an educator or as a researcher, is really important and sadly may for a time be an act of radical defiance. So I think those are important areas. All of this is against the backdrop of a truly existential crisis in climate change.
Yeah.
And we are simply not rising to that. And we're taking all of this time regressing into fundamentalism in various cultural ways, eroding our rights, obfuscating the very obvious scientific truths around that for, very cynical, greedy political reasons and economic reasons. And unfortunately, that's going to cost a lot of lives in coming generations.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that then goes back to the importance of research, the importance of activism. I was very inspired it's a word that gets so abused, I almost wince to say it, but I mean it sincerely in this case by talking to young people on this campus about how sincerely engaged in activism they are. Mm-hmm. And I hope you don't stop. We need people to wake up and be more engaged.
Yeah. I definitely want to echo from the academic side. I think, academics and journalists have a lot in common. And I think especially at this moment where we often see the information now being taken away from us, the resources for us to be able to do the kind of nuanced work that we need to do to be able to continue to create the discourse and build the conversation. And so I think underscoring that, I appreciate you underscoring that. It's very important.
What are you going to do?
We're going to keep working, keep fighting, keep providing the scaffolding that our students need, right? As I said, top of the power of the next generation, we have that in our hands and the ability to continue to raise generations of thoughtful and engaged citizens.
But what are health researchers going to do against a backdrop of radical cuts to health research?
And that's something we're fighting with now. And I think what we are, from thinking about this in terms of sociology, we're trying as much as we can to figure out how to marshal what resources we can, right, as we see our funding cut, as we see the information going out. And there's lots of different approaches, right, that we can take to be able to reach out to the audiences in the meantime. I think, we're not going to stop the same way I think you encourage, through your journalism, that despite what's happening and the attacks, you're not going to stop either. And I think that is an important lesson.
I agree. Yeah, and thank you for your part in that.
Well, thank you for your part in that, too. Okay, we're going to open the floor now for Q&A. So here are the rules. Put the hands down. You will come up to the microphones, okay, because this is streamed, and so we will not be able to hear you otherwise. I'm going to ask, because this is an educational environment, if you do give priority to our beloved students. And once again, a reminder about the fact that this is a generative, open, but respectful environment. So please keep your questions brief, but also respectful as well. Please come up to the microphone.
Hello.
Hi.
Firstly, thank you so much for coming to our campus to deliver this talk and engaging in this conversation. And thank you, Professor Green, for hosting or moderating. I am a Bowdoin graduate from the class of 2022. I know you said give priority to students, but I think to be an alumnus means to be a Bowdoin student forevermore.
Amen. Amen.
Anyway, I especially appreciate the way you have brought the conversation about the importance of nuance to our campus. You touched upon the relief that people feel nowadays to engage in conversations related to politics. I agree with that, but I also disagree with that. I think that Bowdoin College is a small community, and yet it's huge. And it's also a microcosm of the world. It is a representation of what happens in corners of our world. And I think one of those things is, and this is based on my lived experience and my own bias, but again, nuance, right? I mean, this is one of the things that I observe about Bowdoin. And even within Bowdoin, there are specific corners where people believe in what they believe in to the very end, and that's wonderful. And it's wonderful to be passionate and, to quote the offer of the college, to get lost in generous enthusiasms as one of the promises to Bowdoin students and staff. It's beautiful to have a generous enthusiasm, to believe in what you believe in passionately. That's a wonderful thing. However, there is a line, I think, and out of respect for that line, people are polite, and they do the Bowdoin hello, and that's perfectly fine, considering that we do have those limitations, right, of time. We have spans of 60 seconds on air to deliver something. I'll hurry up. My question is, what specific advice would you give to Bowdoin College and to liberal arts colleges alike that are small and have communities and have rituals and rules of politeness, so that they can embrace nuance in ways that perhaps we have not embraced historically because we need to be polite, or because we have class to get to, or because we have to say hello to each other, or not? That's my question.
Well, it's hard without knowing what you're referring to specifically in terms of shortfalls of nuance to answer the question. And the way you kind of set up those qualities as being in opposition, politeness and nuance, is curious to me, because if anything, what I would expect is
Right.
that the qualities that would be at odds are sort of being more of a reductive, anger-driven firebrand on the one hand, and politeness on the other. Like, nuance, if anything, and living in shades of gray and embracing complication, to me feels quite compatible with politeness.
Yes.
Well, if I can reframe the question a little bit, I think, part of having the discourse sometimes means having difficult conversation.
Yes.
And what does it mean to be able to have difficult conversations in a world where we're also where we see difficult conversations and civility being in opposition in some capacity?
Absolutely true. And the truth is, this goes back to my observation about the failures of various facets of the polite establishment, including in politics. I think that I hold both of these ideals, that one should live in those shades of gray, and have granular conversations about complication, and be able to address people across the aisle of whatever conversation you're having in human, rounded terms, understanding that they contain things you agree with, things you disagree with, that they're not monolithic. But I also simultaneously hold the ideal that it is necessary to shake things up and make people uncomfortable, and that radicalism, including radical truths, for instance, in the line of work I'm in, is really, really important.
Yeah.
And most of the, to go back to the journalism lens through which to view this, most of the great stories that have shaped history have been ones that required unearthing and publicizing uncomfortable truths that made people mad or hurt. So it's a part of my job that I'm not that naturally suited to, because I'm not interpersonally someone who likes to get into spats. I'm very much a people pleaser, and I really like trying to connect with people and see what makes them tick, and to share with them that I'm like a person who is there to support them. That's my default posture. But I also know that to make progress and to shape things from a position of understanding the truth, you have to include the most difficult truths.
Yeah.
And I think, therefore, kindness is really the ideal that the word I would ascribe to that part of the set of ideals that we're talking about, rather than politeness. I think it is possible to be driven by thoughtfulness and empathy and compassion, but also be willing to be impolite in the sense that uncomfortable truths are going to sometimes make people uncomfortable. And, the more you can do to hold people through that emotionally and be caring to them interpersonally, the better. But the fact is, the hard conversations, the hard truths, the hard asks are going to destabilize those relationships at times, and people will dislike you as a result. So I think we want to pass on to the next generation the value of making people uncomfortable at times.
Yeah. I mean, that's what growth is, right? As
Yeah.
we're talking about the beginning
Yeah.
of your speech. Thank you for your question.
And to echo, being okay with being disliked.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
Yes.
Right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for that.
Yes, come on up.
Echoing again, thank you. This has been wonderful. I want to pull on a thread. Sorry, I want to pull on a thread you mentioned earlier. I think a lot of people of my parents' generation have this kind of hyper focus on wanting nonpartisan news. But as you mentioned earlier, you sort of seem to believe in a kind of a truth that is independent from that. And I guess I'd love to hear more about this difference between sort of truth and nonpartisanness, and sort of how that factors into your work and what you see for the medium as a whole in the future.
Well, of course, this is a deeply complicated philosophical conversation, and I'm not so naive as to suggest that it is possible to have a deep exploration of the facts of the world architected by human beings that is void of values. And I think that is okay. I think, there are certain values that I consider to be inalienable. I think respecting human beings and considering human suffering to be a negative thing. There are foundational beliefs that do inflect my work, and I feel very comfortable with that. A basic commitment to human rights and freedoms. Being opposed to oppression and slavery. Having a kind of general framework of egalitarian values in terms of access to care and resources in the world. Now, of course, once you get beyond basic principles, each of those statements spirals into very complicated, divisive political conversations. I think that the task of the journalist is to probe the facts and the various views surrounding the facts, bringing to it insight and ideas and potentially analytical frameworks that introduce different ideas from different populations with different beliefs. And to make sure, to the question about what it means to be nonpartisan in the coverage, that you are giving each perspective surrounding a set of facts a fair shake. And I think a fair shake can sometimes mean that it's, well, there's this one belief, and then there's another belief. And maybe reasonable minds could differ about them. And in other circumstances, and with other fact patterns, a fair shake means saying, we've explored the perspectives around this, and one of them does not hold up to scrutiny on the facts. This is based on falsehoods. And unfortunately, that requires the set of principles the previous questioner just raised. It requires making people uncomfortable and having some people get mad at you. And there was, I think, over recent years, a paucity of journalists willing to do that, and institutions willing to do that. And then they kind of started more recently, but far too late. And that did create a lot of, forgive my French, bullshit coverage with a lot of contorting in the direction of this side and that side with respect to fact patterns where that was patently ridiculous, and to sustain the both sidesism actually required being unfactual. So that's unfortunate, and I think flowed from a lack of courage.
And I wonder the extent to which, I think good journalism also is generative in terms of how it creates discourse outside of it, from the perspective of, the consumer who reads it. And so, again, I think that one of the dangers is living in a world where, again, we can easily dismiss as opposed to being able to do the nuance deconstruction on our own in terms of how we read and receive information through the various stories and how they're framed and the kinds of questions that they ask.
It's a complicated question how much perspective should go into a given story. I talked earlier today while I was on campus about some of my coverage of Elon Musk, and that coverage is very nonpartisan in the sense that it doesn't sort of hew to one political movement's views, but actually had a very strong sense of analytical perspective in that I was looking, this was now, I'm referring to like when I wrote a profile of him a couple of years ago. I was looking at his specific relationships with government entities, particularly his role as a government contractor, a defense contractor, and realizing that he had in some of those relationships made those officials who should have had oversight actually feel cowed and disempowered because he had accumulated so much power and the government had accreted such dependency on his services. And so there was a strong kind of historical, analytical point of view about the perils of capitalism gone awry and the over-concentration of power in the hands of an individual and how that's threatening to the provision of basic government services. And I would say that analytical historical frame has held up, unfortunately, quite well, given the recent news cycle. So that's a good, every story is case by case, but I felt very comfortable and not like it was a sign of any kind of bias or malign partisanship to look at history in that sense and to draw those conclusions, which were not, I'm not writing an op-ed in that case. So it's not, here's a problem and here's why it's wrong, per se. It's not framed in terms of like, we should do something different. It's arraying the facts in front of people to say, like, here are the historical examples of what happens to populations when you see this over-concentration of power. And here are the dynamics around specific cases where he is, for instance, controlling internet access during the war in Ukraine. And here's the perspective of the commanders on the ground, and here's the perspective of the people at the Pentagon and the White House, and letting the audience be concerned about what they may in that fact pattern. So it's not that it's uninflected, but it's also not leading in a politicized way, per se.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Earlier in the night, you had mentioned the it kind of Kierkegaardian anxiety of our own freedom that, excuse me, that you think is at least somewhat ingrained in our human nature. And I tend to agree that it's a hurdle that all democratic peoples have had to overcome. How do you can lead a horse to water, the water being free information, what the journalist does, but how do you get them to drink? And I'm wondering, in our current historical conditions, exactly what prognosis you would have for our people, how you would get them to drink. Maybe not the journalist's job, but...
Do you have an answer?
No, I'm asking.
No, I'm genuinely looking for answers in the world. I mean, I think that there's several answers that have occurred to me in the course of my life and work. One it was touched on earlier when I talked about the relief I sometimes see people experience when you cut through the disinformation and partisan rancor and just talk to people like adults with nuance and in a way that is not inflected by factionalism. That there are some people who are so dug in that they are unwilling to engage in that conversation, but there's also plenty of people who are like, oh, okay, there are fair brokers out there who want to connect and excavate the facts, and are willing to back down too and like self-reflect and self-critique. I think that's a huge part of the conversation about nuance we're talking about, that all of us need to be willing to say, okay, how right am I really, all the time? Self-questioning is also antithetical to the authoritarian moment, and is part of what will pull us out of this rut we're in. I think that giving people that glimmer of hope that there can be integrity and reasonable conversation just by living those values is super important. I think embodying that in your social media, in your personal interactions, being that person who is kind of compassionate and thoughtful and self-questioning, but also firm in your values and what you stand for, but willing to listen and engage, and willing to dig into the facts and present them. I think that there's a real place for that in all of our personal lives. And certainly in how we conduct ourselves professionally, whatever profession you go into. So I think we can live by example. I think we can embody those qualities. And then I also think a lot about how I can tell stories that reveal truths that matter, but within a framework of human experience that will make them resonate. I've seen the full spectrum from stories I do that are sort of so nerdy and about some, government whistleblower who identified some specific breach of people's due process in court cases and, was right, but it's really complicated to explain. And I just know that that's a story that matters and that I'm proud to spend a lot of time on, but I'm not going to be on CNN all day talking about it. Like maybe it'll affect the case law around this particular issue. But then also I've been involved in stories where it does take over the media for days and days and days, and been able to kind of replicate that. So I think my job is to not be a prisoner to those kind of dramatic imperatives of it needs to be sensational. I'm against sensationalism. But I am not against identifying stories that have both qualities, that matter in their bones in the fact pattern, but also are populated by individuals that people will relate to, that have developments and twists and turns that people will be emotionally invested in, just in any true telling of the facts. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that that's unjournalistic, and I think it can be one vehicle for leading people to water, to try to also give them storytelling that they care about within the bounds of something that is precise and clinical and truthful.
Thank you.
I love that. I think it also speaks in terms of what academics are also struggling with in this particular moment as well, right? Writing and doing the research and doing things that can be so specified to particular audiences, but then also making that work impactful to the publics beyond. the ivory tower and the students that we teach, right? I think it's one of the reasons why people express that concern about academia being one of these bastions of indoctrination, as opposed to also us seeking out certain truths and being able to analyze that with a certain element of nuance.
It's a topic I think about a lot too with respect to telling stories in different mediums.
Yeah.
Because I work in television and film, in audio, in print, I'm constantly thinking through, okay, maybe not every story will work in all of those mediums, but I have had stories that attracted, a big zeitgeist presence in print, but then an order of magnitude more consumers of that story in audio. The New Yorker Harvey Weinstein initial story that I did, I think, I don't know what that number would be now, but it got somewhere in the low millions of clicks, I think, in some initial window, which is just a very back of the napkin foundation for then saying, okay, I did a podcast that was more about the experience of telling that story and trying to break it, that was more narrative because of the nature of focus in it, and had 10 times that audience.
Okay.
And there are lots of different metrics for getting people to engage with a story or a set of truths, and viewership or listenership is not the only one.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I would argue, therefore, that a book I wrote on that topic or a podcast or TV show were more impactful. I actually think the initial revelations in the print story, of course, were in their own way much more of a lightning in a bottle moment. If we're looking at this challenge of how do you get people to sit up and take notice.
Yeah.
But that whole unfurling of different translations of different facets of a story did teach me, and I've now sort of replicated that in a couple of other cases, that you can draw out different things people care about using these different formats. And so for student journalists in the room in particular, I think probably whatever the solution is to navigating the brokenness of that industry, part of it is going to be leveraging different formats in a smart way.
Yeah. We have time for a couple more questions.
Hi. Putting aside the New Yorker and David Remnick, sadly for the moment, I'm wondering who or what are you finding yourself turning to read about the news on a sort of daily basis in this particular political moment? I want you to name names. Probably.
Yeah, no, I honestly, I really wish I had a better, more novel answer to that, because I have just been imbibing more than usual, kind of the usual suspects. I've got Washington Post push alerts, BBC push alerts. I am looking at the more investigative outlets like ProPublica. I do have Wall Street Journal push alerts on, and I wind up reading a fair amount of their coverage. So that's not a particularly revelatory answer, but it is a moment where, because there's such a flooding of the zone with illegality, a lot of what's happening journalistically is just breaking news coverage scrambling to keep up. So I think it is a moment that is particularly suited to breaking news papers and a more complicating challenge for investigative journalists who want to do something deep. How do you unearth new facts that people will actually care about in the midst of a cyclone of madness? That's the challenge for investigative reporters right now.
I'm reminded during a conversation you had with our beloved esteemed president, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you were talking about reading multiple different kinds of papers, right, and from different perspectives, and how difficult that can be. Is that something that you would recommend in terms of helping us at least get a sense of how the discourse is being shaped around a particular issue or topic?
Yeah, no, plenty of times I go to different partisan sources around an issue to understand the contours of the dialogue around it. Around immigration stuff, I was recently reading like Cato Institute stuff, libertarian commentary. that's a great example also of how I think in the midst of the current moment, one thing that I've been finding myself doing is going to underlying research and numbers, whether it's sort of PubMed articles about scholarly literature about health issues around areas that are receiving cuts right now, or on the immigration question, actually looking at the underlying economic analyses. What is the economic footprint and impact of the border control being stronger or less strong? What is the criminal impact of undocumented immigrants? And these are great examples too of where political storytelling does not necessarily align with the facts, right? A whole movement has just been ushered into power based on a disproportionate amount of focus on this idea that undocumented immigrants and immigration in general are bad for the economy. And that's a pretty dubious conclusion, actually, as far as I can see, based on the facts. Yeah. Actually, it seems like most sane economic analyses see immigration as pretty fundamental to economic growth, and even undocumented immigrants in a country as being not necessarily an impediment to growth. So that's a great, just hyper-specific example, also of the conversation about nuance that we're having. There's no space in our political dialogue to do anything other than sort of emotional rage gesturing on these subjects. But I really wish for more space in which there could be data-driven discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more quick question. Anyone? Okay, thank you.
So not to be an agent of sensationalism, but I was just wondering if you would feel comfortable sharing a stance on which you differ significantly from those of your milieu, like just for fun.
Who's my milieu?
I don't know. I don't know. It seems like sort of the takes and lines of reasoning that you've been espousing are kind of the capital T takes of the moment in a way.
Capital T?
Yeah, takes.
Take away.
So I don't know. I guess it's sort of if you would sort of imagine something. Well, I guess, do you ever sort of imagine or sort of sensationalism for fun?
Do I imagine sensationalism for fun?
Or sensationally?
Interesting. Yeah, you circled around a couple of questions there.
Yeah.
Do I feel the allure of sensationalism?
Yeah. I guess I was going for more of kind of like a cute personal trivia kind of thing, but it's up to you. I know I'm papering over a lot of deeper issues, but it's
does this boil down to what am I an extremist on? Do you think? I'm trying to think. I guess maybe you pointed out a way in which I would never make it in politics, because I think the whole posture of let's get into the nitty-gritty nuance is a little bit antithetical to the kind of the fun, oversimplified sensationalism. I do, in terms of the first question you asked about whether I sort of hew to a particular set of political views, first of all, as a reporter, I tend not to get into just opining, right? I say I keep my powder dry for when I'm doing a detailed factional analysis. But there are all kinds of issues on which I really parted ways with, the way, for instance, modern Democrat liberals in this country were going culturally, and where I really understand how some of that got exploited in the current political discourse and sort of led to where we are right now. So I like to think of myself as independent, but probably not sensationalist. I do think that when I'm writing a story or working on a documentary series or something, it's definitely always a balancing act to try to invest in those properties that we just talked about dramatically, to say oh, this is a really rich character, a person who will inspire empathy, and therefore a complicated work of portraiture here will cause people to be invested. Or, you know, this is an incredible way in which this story defies your expectations when you first go into it. So that's a big moment here. And to kind of, to invest in telling the story in a way that's true to those things that are going to make it resonate, but on the other hand, to keep from ever going sensationalist. Like, I do think in a way it is a siren song around storytelling and journalism that is, you know, has a devastating sharp set of rocks at the end. You gotta really every moment check, like, am I indulging in sensationalism at all? Is this too over the top? Can I tone it down a little? And there's all kinds of, you know, a million little editorial decisions around every project embodies that challenge. Like, every headline that's written, and journalists often don't even write their own headlines. Many of my headlines were not written by me, but there are times where I've looked at headlines that have run over pieces I've written and gone like, that's a little too simplistic or extreme. The New Yorker, I think, is way more measured than most places. That was such a not fun answer to your question about whether I fantasize about sensationalism. I'm going to sit up in the middle of the night and have like a really extremist, sensationalist, enraged urge, and I'll think of you.
That is a fun way to end the conversation. Please join me in thanking Ronan Farrow.
Thank you, everybody.
I love that. Okay, good night, everyone.
Dismissed. Class.